Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a glittering slice of ancient India, where feathers shimmer, incense wafts from temple halls, and numbers swirl in every corner like fireflies at dusk. You're walking barefoot across the cool stone tiles of a Gupta-era courtyard, soft voices echoing around pillars carved with mythical beasts and vines. Somewhere nearby, a bamboo flute hums lazily. The air smells like sandalwood, ink, and maybe, just maybe, a hint of mango pickle someone forgot on a windowsill. And there it is, a peacock, right in the middle of a lesson, tail fanned out in full glorious defiance of math class decorum. Blues like lapis lazuli, greens that could shame emeralds, and an arrogant head tilt like it knows it's the main character. You'd think the students would be distracted, but nope. Every eye is fixed, not on the peacock but on the teacher, who's actually using the bird in her lecture. Yes, welcome to the Gupta Empire, sometime in the 4th century CE. A golden age of art, science, literature, and apparently, very helpful peacocks. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge closer to the semicircle of students seated on palm leaf mats. The teacher gestures elegantly toward the peacock, and the students obediently pick up styluses and scribble furiously on bark paper slates. "Observe the radial symmetry," she says, voice low and hypnotic. A perfect example of recursive patterning. Count the outer eye spots. Now the inner. They are, of course, doing math. But not the dry kind. This is intuitive, almost meditative. The peacock isn't just decoration, it's data. Living geometry, a walking formula in feathers. Historians still argue whether this sort of scene was common or poetic fantasy. Gupta manuscripts are rare, often copied centuries later, but fragments hint at a pedagogical world where nature itself, especially the peacock, served as chalkboard and compass. You inch over to a boy maybe 12 years old and peek at his work. He sketched the bird's tail with astonishing detail. 22 feathers, each labeled with a number in Brahmi script. Ratios between lengths are noted. The outermost feathers are exactly twice the length of the inner cluster. A row of fractions dances along the margin. 1, 2, 2, 3, 3 to 4. Master Pingala says the peacock's tail teaches balance. The boy whispers. Odd and even, wide and narrow, sound and silence. Sound and silence? You cock your head. Just then, the peacock screeches. It's awful. Like a rusted trumpet mixed with a toddler tantrum. A few students giggle. One clutches his ears in despair. But the teacher nods gravely. The cry breaks the rhythm. Marks the interval. Even chaos has its measure. Okay then. That's one way to teach algebra. You stroll further into the monastery gardens, past statues of Sarasvati and Ganesha, toward a stone terrace where older students practice geometry. One girl balances on her knees, drawing diagrams with a bronze compass on thin parchment. A senior monk corrects her angles by referencing, you guessed it, a feather. Look here. This curve follows the same arc as a peacock's sweep in full dance. You try to visualize it. A peacock circling in that hypnotic sidestepping strut. Each twist of its body generates spirals, parabolas, loops. Geometry isn't abstract here. It's embodied. Danced, performed by birds. And while yes, the Gupta Empire produced dense astronomical treatises and intricate equations, the starting point? More often than not, something fluttering past the window. Historians tend to spotlight the big stuff, the invention of zero, decimal notation, sign tables. But in the daily life of these students, learning was tactile and playful. You didn't just memorize, you observed. You counted feathers. You measured tailspans. You tried to outdoodle your friend's peacock spiral, all in service of deeper truths. In one clay tablet on display nearby, you spot a riddle scratched in looping script. If 3 peacocks dance, each displaying 14 eye spots, and one loses 2 in a storm. What remains when silence falls? You try to solve it, then realize the answer isn't numerical, it's poetic. Symmetry broken. These kids were math nerds and romantics. Dangerous combo. A novice monk offers you a steaming clay cup of warm cardamom milk. You sip, letting the spicy sweetness sink into your bones, and hear him mutter, "They say when the peacock opens its tail at dawn, the gods learn their first lesson of the day." Is it superstition? Symbolism? Or some ancient mnemonic device no one remembers anymore? Historians still argue whether such sayings were educational, devotional, or just bedtime stories that stuck too well. But either way, they matter, because you're beginning to see the truth. The peacock wasn't just a bird. It was a mirror, a metaphor, a metric. And counting it, feathers, calls, steps, dreams, was the Gupta way of wresting order from chaos. The monastery bell chimes. Students roll up scrolls, brush away chalk dust, and bow toward the eastern wall where a painted peacock perches mid-leap across a mosaic sun. You follow the exodus toward the dormitories, still half listening for another shriek in the dark, and as you pass a stone inscription, you pause to run your fingers across the etched phrase in elegant Sanskrit. In each pattern, the peacock hides a number. No pressure or anything. You wake to the sound of rustling feathers and soft muttering. The sky above is peach gray, the kind of morning haze that makes everything look like a sepia-toned painting. You roll over on your straw mat inside the monastery dormitory, still, groggy, and watch as 2 boys tiptoe past the open door, arms cradling bundles of feathers. You follow them. Outside, the courtyard is already alive with clinks of ink pots and the whisper of quills over palm leaves. But today, something's different. The students are gathered in clusters, comparing what look like tail feathers, each arranged on the ground like clues in a riddle. A teacher, her robe the color of old turmeric, kneels beside one of the groups. "Count the outer veins," she says softly. "Then note the spacing. Symmetry is the soul of truth." You kneel beside a student who's just placed 5 long iridescent feathers in a fan shape. "What are you doing?" you whisper. He points to a thin bark scroll where someone has drawn a feather broken into labeled parts: rachis, vein, barbs, eye spot. Along the side, a column of fractions. Full length, 1 eye spot position. 2, 3 from base left. Vein. 3, 8. Right. Vein. 5 to 8. "We're converting measurements into ratios," he explains. The peacock tail is a model for balanced proportion, and suddenly you realize you're watching a math lesson in drag. These kids are doing applied geometry, only with feathers instead of rulers. A peacock's plume isn't just pretty, it's a fractal classroom. Historians still argue whether Gupta mathematicians directly measured peacock feathers or simply used them metaphorically. But you're here, and you're watching it unfold. This is hands-on math, ancient style, warm, colorful, and a little feathery. You peek over another student's shoulder and see an even more elaborate chart. 10 feathers, each with differently shaped eye spots. Above each is a number, a glyph in flowing Brahmi script. The student explains it's a system of comparing curves. "See? This one bulges earlier. We assign it a lower value. This one's elongated. We treat it as high. So now it's not just ratios, it's classification." The feathers are teaching them to notice variance and pattern, the way a data scientist might catalog samples or a biologist might sort specimens. And it's all wrapped in the warm iridescence of nature. The teacher calls you over. She's older, her face a tapestry of fine lines and ink smudges. "You see how the barbs angle?" she asks, handing you a feather. "If the angles are unequal, it distorts the symmetry. And symmetry is not just aesthetic, it's mathematical truth." She points to a sand tray nearby where she's drawn a large peacock tail. "We teach ratios, arcs, even tessellation through these." If a student masters this curve, she adds, tracing a spiraling feather path, they are ready for conic sections. Right, just normal math class, if math class included birds, sand art, and the occasional devotional chant. But here's the twist. The feathers aren't just used for learning math. They're also used to represent numbers themselves. In a corner of the courtyard, a boy is setting down feathers in bundles, 3 with long barbs, 4 with tight spirals, 1 short and broken. He's using them as symbols. 1 feather equals 5. Curled ones represent decimals. Some are even tied together to mark thousands. You mean, this is a base system? You ask. He nods. 5, 10, 100. The feathers teach us grouping. The ancient Indian number systems were far from random. The Brahmi numerals, ancestors of the digits we use today, were built to be practical and symbolic. You see it now. The way feathers clump into natural bundles mimics numerical groupings. You don't need a chalkboard. You just need a bird and time. The bell chimes again, high and clear. And now the lesson turns indoors, where the air is thick with gai smoke and the slight musk of old ink. In this quieter room, elder monks sit, with heavy manuscripts, the kind written on cloth, each scroll a tapestry of numbers and drawings. One such scroll is unrolled before you. It shows a stylized peacock, tail split into 12 rays. At the end of each, a fraction. Lunar months, a monk murmurs. Each ray is 2.5 days. When the full moon aligns with the 11th ray, the tale is complete. You're witnessing a feather-based calendar. Lunar, fractional, poetic. Ancient Indian mathematicians had dozens of systems running side by side. Sidereal time, lunar cycles, agricultural rhythms. Sometimes, the best way to keep track of it all? Just count peacocks. And not only feathers. Sometimes even the calls were mathematical events. A young girl leans over her parchment and points out a curious notation. 5 curved lines under a stylized bird. We record how often they call before the rain, she says. If the cry comes 5 times before dawn, the monsoon begins in 7 days. Okay, that one might be a stretch, but it's poetic at least, and it shows how observation was fused with numeracy. The world wasn't divided between math and mythology. It was one giant, chirping data set. Still, some scholars today are skeptical. Coincidence, they say. Folklore mistaken for science. But others argue that Gupta thinkers were far more holistic than we give them credit for. They didn't draw hard lines between data and story. Why should they? In an age before telescopes or Google Sheets, sometimes the best algorithms had feathers and a bad attitude. As the day winds down, a girl approaches the teacher with 2 feathers, one slightly bent. If this is curved here, she asks, how do I draw its inverse? The teacher takes a moment, then draws a mirrored arc, upside down. Now reflect it again along the vertical, she says, and you will have found the axis of truth. You blink. Okay, now this is sounding like a riddle from a yoga fortune cookie. But it's also matrix transformation, reflection across axes. In peacock feathers, you step outside into the cooling dusk. A breeze scatters chalk dust across the tiles, and in the fading light, another peacock appears, tail dragging like a cape, head cocked arrogantly to the side. It gives a half-hearted screech. You almost respond, that's worth at least 3 units of symmetry. You're jolted awake the next morning by something unexpected. Not a bird cry this time, but a sudden clatter of wooden abacuses being pulled from a storage room. You follow the noise, barefoot and bleary-eyed, to a long hall where scribes are setting up what looks like a peacock census station. Yes, a literal bird ledger. Dozens of scrolls are being unrolled, inkpots uncorked, and a wide slate board in the corner lists today's tally. Peacocks observed, 47. Pairs displaying, 6. Juveniles spotted. 3. Feathers shed 21. Someone's already underlining numbers. This isn't art or metaphor, it's record-keeping. Welcome to the Royal Ledger of Birds. Turns out, counting peacocks wasn't just a poetic pastime, it had real logistical value. Peacocks in the Gupta Empire weren't just admired. They were tracked, like livestock or grain shipments. Some monasteries and palaces considered them royal property, especially the prized ones with unusually large or vibrantly colored tails. You think your HOA's chicken ban is strict? Try living under Gupta wildlife policy. You lean in and watch as two scribes debate the entry for Group by Southwell. One argues they saw 8 peacocks. The other insists there were only 6, and 2 were just very fluffy pigeons. One had no crest. The second cries. That's a disqualification. A teacher steps in to mediate, ruling that only peacocks with visible train feathers count toward the ceremonial tally. You scribble that down in your imaginary rulebook of ancient math trivia. Still, you wonder, why all this effort? The answer arrives in the form of a stout older monk who drops a burlap sack of millets and lentils on a table with a dusty thump. Bird behavior predicts harvest trends, he says, eyes twinkling. More feathers shed in a shot a month, more rain, more courtship dances, better mango yield. Historians still argue whether this type of agricultural correlation had any merit or was just seasonal superstition. But what's clear is that the numbers themselves, the raw data, mattered, and gathering that data meant watching the birds. Closely, obsessively. And this is where the math gets deliciously strange. A scroll labeled Vikriti Grantha of the Northern Pond lays out a classification table that is half peacock log, half inventory sheet, half fever dream. It lists bird sightings next to moon phases, crop weights, and oddly specific observations like bird 11, tail feathers shorter than rice stalk, appeared at dawn, skipped once, cried 4 times, rain came 2 nights later, bird 34, stood motionless under neem tree, tail shimmered faintly, mango sap unusually bitter that week. You start to see the rhythm of it. They weren't just counting feathers, they were correlating bird behavior with all kinds of natural data. Some entries even speculate in polite cursive whether particular peacock displays influenced the behavior of humans, such as a nearby market's prices or a courtier's mood. Oh, he wore indigo silk today. One note reads, 3 males fought over a perch at noon. Coincidence? You smirk. Maybe. Maybe not. Another monk pulls you aside and shows you a much older clay tablet, brittle at the corners. This one, he whispers, was kept by a grain tax collector. On the tablet are tiny tick marks next to stylized peacock heads. The number of calls per morning was used to predict grain transport readiness. If the peacocks were unusually noisy, carts were sent early. Less risk of flood delay. Okay. So now we've gone from metaphor to meteorology to logistics. Counting peacocks is starting to look more like ancient data science. Peacocks are excellent seasonal indicators, says a passing scholar, overhearing your thoughts. Monsoon triggers their courtship. More birds dancing, more humidity. You track enough years, you start to see patterns. And that's the crux. Pattern recognition. Whether through myth, math, or meteorology, the Gupta obsession with peacocks stems from one core truth. They were a ready-made natural system, full of repeatable, observable phenomena. The kind of system that naturally lends itself to early statistical thinking. There's even a large stone ring in the center of the garden, where students have carved the names of months into the perimeter. Inside they've been marking the number of birds observed each day with etched notches. You realize it's a circular bar graph, a proto-pie chart, except the slices chirp. You're nudged out of your reverie by a student dragging a clump of discarded tail feathers toward a weighing station. Mass matters, he says. More moisture in the air, heavier the feather. You weigh one yourself. It's lighter than you expect, almost weightless. And yet for centuries, people have piled all sorts of meaning onto these delicate plumes. Near the edge of the compound, A different group of scribes is at work on a more mystical task, calculating auspicious times for weddings and rituals. A thin boy with a serious face shows you a lunar calendar with feather sketches marking certain days. "These are the days we saw paired peacocks," he says. "Double luck! Double luck! Because one bird is good, but two in sync, preening and turning in mirrored spirals? That's geometry and romance wrapped into one feathery flourish." At this point, your head's spinning. What started as a simple bird-watching hobby has revealed itself to be a full-fledged numerological, agricultural, calendrical, and statistical operation, all built on birds. And if you're being honest, you're starting to suspect some of those peacocks know exactly how important they are. One of them near the dining hall gives you a haughty glance, then resumes his absurdly graceful strut. You half expect him to charge you rent for standing on his veranda. You jot a final note in your mental journal. Peacocks in Gupta, India were not just symbols of beauty, they were part of the infrastructure. And in a way, they still are. Their likenesses decorate ancient coins. Their feathers feature in medical texts. Their forms dance through literature and poetry. But more importantly, they were counted, measured, watched, again and again. Because hidden in that endless loop of shimmer and shriek, the Gupta mathematicians saw patterns. And where there are patterns, there is math. You're sitting in the dappled shade of a neem tree now, watching a group of students gathered around a sand tray. They're drawing circles with sticks, refining their arcs with careful flicks of the wrist. You glance down and realize they aren't just doodling. They're reconstructing a peacock's tail fan, feather by feather, as concentric arcs. And this is where things get decimal. One boy, barely 10, takes a smooth stone and carves a line through the middle of his design. "This is the median," he mutters. "Now I count half of everything. Half of everything." Turns out these Gupta kids are building a math system around subdivision, balance, and comparison. You watch in awe as another student starts dividing the feathers into fractional sections. One tail fan, 4 quadrants, each with exactly 9 eye spots. She scribbles, 936, 14. Welcome to the birthplace of the decimal system. Historians generally agree that Gupta mathematicians were among the first to systematically use place value notation and decimals. And no, they didn't invent the concept overnight. It emerged organically, often through necessity, like trying to describe increasingly precise patterns in peacock feathers. You glance down at the patterns in the sand again. These aren't just sketches. They're data visualizations, radial plots before we had names for them. Each curve, each eye, is a unit, a part of a whole, a decimal waiting to be born. One older monk walks by and chuckles. You think of decimals as numbers. We think of them as whispers between whole thoughts. Okay, that's both beautiful and wildly impractical for budgeting. Still, it makes a weird kind of sense. The peacock's tail isn't composed of neat holes. It's dazzling precisely because of the fine gradations, the subtle shifts from one feather to the next. And that nuance, that's where the decimal lives. You're invited to a geometry demonstration in the upper gallery. A teacher rolls out a canvas showing a peacock tail drawn with intense precision. Each feather is segmented into tenths, then into hundredths. "Observe the spacing," she instructs. "Not equal, but proportional. Golden." Fibonacci may have written later, but the peacock danced it first. Historians still argue whether Indian mathematicians understood the golden ratio or just approximated its beauty. Either way, they got pretty darn close. You run your finger along one arc, perfectly smooth, feather after feather, widening outward with mathematical confidence. It's basically a logarithmic spiral, except alive. And that brings us to a funny detail. Ancient students often learned place value by literally placing value on feathers. In the center of the room is a wooden board with slots labeled 1, 10, and 100. Students drop feathers into the slots to construct numbers. 2 in the 1 slot, 4 in the 10, 1 in the 100. Voila, 142. No chalk, no ink. Just math in full plumage. You're handed a palm leaf scroll with a riddle inscribed in thick black script. I have one tail, but many eyes. Split me and I double. Join me and I disappear. What am I? You think for a moment, then realize it's a decimal point. The humble dot that changes 1 to 0.1, multiplies or vanishes depending on its placement. And maybe in some metaphorical way, it's also a peacock feather. Beautiful, small, powerful in the right position. But decimals weren't just for art and riddles. They had practical applications. In the merchant quarter near the monastery, you're led to a stone table carved with price charts. Everything's measured in tiny units. 0.25 dharana for spice, 0.125 for a strip of silk, 0.0625 for a sprig of jasmine. You blink. They're not just using decimals, they're using binary fractions. Long before computers, one shopkeeper sees your amazement and laughs. We use the feather rule. If you cut a feather in half, does it still shimmer? If yes, it's still valuable. Even fractions have beauty. That might just be the world's most poetic sales pitch for pricing lentils. You pause for a moment, thinking back to modern school days, grappling with decimals and wondering why they mattered. Here, there's no such mystery. You want to divide a feather? You better know your base 10. One novice student stands up proudly with a new invention, a pebble abacus shaped like a peacock. Each bead is a colorful plumage stone. The rows represent tenths, hundredths, and thousandths. It's both toy and calculator, and the teacher gives him a nod of approval. He beams like he just cracked the Riemann hypothesis. Even temple architects use decimal notation. You're taken to a carving chamber where stoneworkers use chalked strings to mark walls. Measurements are laid out in perfect grids. 2.5 cubits wide, 0.625 cubits deep. They're using place-value math to design sacred spaces with proportions based on, guess what? Peacock tail spreads. One elder runs her hand over a pillar and says, each groove is cut according to tail symmetry. We trust the peacock's math more than the rulers. And you realize that here, the decimal isn't abstract. It's embodied. It's a line in the sand, a shimmer on a feather, a flick of a craftsman's chisel. A way to describe what exists between the solid numbers. One final twist. There's a hidden philosophical layer to all this. Some Gupta philosophers believed decimals were reflections of the subtle world, that which exists between states. Whole numbers were like the physical world, decimals, the spiritual whisper between. One dusty scroll quotes a poet mathematician. A peacock has one body, but 10,000 shimmers. So too is the universe, whole yet fractioned. That kind of thing makes your calculator seem positively dull. As the lesson ends, students gather their feathers, shake out their robes, and head toward the evening fire for stories. One kid flips a feather upside down and says, "If you reverse the dot, does the world fall apart?" His friend shrugs. "Only if you forget to carry the one." You chuckle. Gupta humor. Decimal jokes. Who knew? By now, your feet know the monastery paths by heart, the polished stones underfoot, the dry rustle of neem leaves, the occasional rogue goat with attitude. But this morning, something new calls to you. A group of astronomers in saffron robes hunched around a massive stone disk set into the courtyard. It's a calendar wheel etched with stars, moons, and, of course, stylized peacocks. You slip closer just in time to hear the lead astronomer mutter, "The peacocks cried late last week. That's a shift." His assistant flips open a scroll of observations. 3 days after full moon, he says. Sun rose warm. Call began 1.2 hours later than normal. Okay, you weren't prepared for avian timekeeping, and yet it makes a bizarre kind of sense. For centuries, Gupta mathematicians and astronomers tracked not only stars and lunar phases, but also patterns in animal behavior, especially in the peacocks that strutted through temples, palaces, and monasteries like they owned the place. Today's mission? Trying to synchronize the lunar calendar with the natural world, specifically, the bird calls that precede monsoon season. One scribe hands you a brittle palm scroll labeled Shravana Notes. You squint at the faded Brahmi script. It records 27 moon phases, each with a corresponding peacock cry range. Most entries are boring. 5 cries before sunrise, silent, 10 cries after dusk. But then there's this one. On the 3rd day before full moon, 11 cries sounded in sequence. Rains followed within 4 days. Crops sprouted early. Historians still argue whether this was real data or the wishful thinking of overly poetic monks. But what's clear is this. They were looking for correlations between sound, time, and nature. Trying to map chaos with feathers and fractions, wouldn't stars be more reliable? You ask one of the younger scholars. He shrugs. Stars tell you where you are. Birds tell you when to act. You're ushered to another chamber where a group of monks is designing a lunar calendar for the upcoming season. The chart is circular, divided into 30 tithas, or lunar days. And in the corner, sure enough, each tithe is marked with tiny stylized birds. Wings open, wings folded, tail curled. They aren't just illustrations, says the calendar maker. Each bird represents a mood of the moon, a behavior pattern. You lean in. The 3rd day of the waxing phase? Tail half raised. The 10th day? Wing sweep. The full moon? Total fan. And on each of those days they predict when the peacocks will display. One monk chimes in, we use the tail arc to adjust our time intervals. A full fan equals about 1 gatika, 24 minutes. If the dance lasts longer, something's wrong. Something's wrong? You raise an eyebrow. Possibly wind, he clarifies, or planetary misalignment, or a demon. Classic Gupta explanation. Astronomy or demons, take your pick. Still, the calendar's structure is elegant. The way it weaves together lunar movement, weather shifts, bird behavior, and seasonal markers feels like something between an operating system and a symphony score. You watch as a boy marks the current day with a dab of indigo ink. Peacocks danced early, he says. Today we adjust timekeeping by 1-3 gatika forward. Wait, so they're using bird behavior to correct their time? Yes. Yes, they are. Historians still debate how accurate this method was, but some records suggest it worked, at least enough to fine-tune temple ceremonies and crop planning. In a nearby archive room, you find an even stranger scroll, a chart plotting peacock cries against moonlight intensity. The cries are grouped by volume and direction. East-facing cries, it notes, occur more often in late waxing phases. No one knows if this is scientifically valid, but the data spans 15 years. Someone clearly believed in the power of the peacock compass. And then, you hear it. A sharp, echoing screech from the upper orchard. Students go still. A monk clicks his tongue and checks a sundial. Too early, he mutters. The next few minutes are chaos. Scribes run to update their charts. Monks argue over tail angles and breeze patterns. One elderly teacher just leans back and says, well, the birds know something we don't. You're starting to believe him. Later that evening, you're invited to sit with the astronomers beneath the stars. They sip warm milk with turmeric, unroll a star map across the courtyard stones, and begin pointing out constellations. But what catches your eye isn't the familiar arc of Orion. It's a peacock-shaped cluster traced into the sky with glowing oil lamps. They call it Mayura Tara, peacock star. Not a real constellation, but a symbolic one. We chart this during monsoon transitions, the elder explains. When the rains come late and the birds stay silent, we ask the sky for permission to proceed. You lie back, staring at the artificial constellation flickering in the wind, and realize this isn't just math. It's ritualized math, calculation wrapped in myth, tied to seasons, grounded in squawks and tail fans and mud. Even the monk beside you concedes, much of our astronomy comes from the sky, but our timing comes from the earth, and the earth listens to birds. At some point, it's hard to tell whether they're charting the peacocks or the peacocks are charting them. One final detail sticks with you as the night cools. In a secret alcove behind the timekeeping hall, you find a wall of carved peacocks, one for each month. Underneath each, a phrase is etched. Fan open, moon rise. Tail twist, clouds fall. Wing sweep, time bends. You pause at the last one, time bends. It might be poetry, or it might be ancient scheduling wizardry. Either way, in the Gupta world, if the peacock dances, you listen. Because in the flick of a feather, between dusk and dawn, time itself might shift just enough for rain, or revelation. The morning is unusually quiet. Too quiet. You notice it first as you pass through the monastery gardens. No screeches, no rustling plumage, no arrogant bird stomping through geometry class like he owns the place. Even the trees seem to lean in with curiosity. Where are the peacocks? You ask a novice monk, who shrugs. Gone to the lower grove. Something spooked them. And that's when you meet the monk named Arya. He's perched at the edge of the northern balcony, chalking equations onto a slate slab, utterly indifferent to the chaos behind him. He looks like someone who would forget his sandals and invent the universe. When you approach, he waves vaguely toward a bare courtyard. It's better when they're gone. Easier to think about nothing. You nod slowly, but he keeps going. Nothing is a concept, but also a value, and the peacock is how I saw it. Wait, what? He sits back, brushing chalk dust from his saffron robe, and invites you to sit. Then he tells you the story of how, one early morning, he watched a group of peacocks pecking at the ground. There were seeds scattered, some eaten, some ignored. But one bird, he says, eyes narrowing, pecked at a patch of dust where no seeds were. Over and over. You frown. So, he says, as if revealing a state secret, it interacted with nothing, gave it effort, assigned it a pattern. You sit with that for a second, and then it clicks. 0. That sneaky, slippery idea. Not a placeholder, not a gap, a thing unto itself. Historians still argue whether Aryabhata or someone else in the Gupta period was the first to conceptualize 0 as a number, not just a symbol. But here, on this balcony, with chalk underfoot and peacocks on sabbatical, you're watching it happen. Or at least something like it. Arya continues, drawing spirals, loops, dots, and symbols. I used to think of numbers as grains, he says, things you collect. But now I see them as feathers, a fan of possibilities. And sometimes, a feather goes missing. The space it leaves behind. That's the true marvel. You ask him how this connects to peacocks again, and he smiles like it's obvious. Because the bird that pecks at nothing, he says, is still dancing. Okay, you're now in full philosophical math mode. Downstairs, a group of students is working with number lines. Long scrolls with vertical marks drawn carefully in ink. In the center is a curious dot. Not a number, not a symbol. Just a gap, labeled with a tiny peacock silhouette. 0 point, the teacher explains. Everything folds around it. And it's true. You can see positive values spreading rightward, negative ones leftward, all stemming from this one enigmatic center. It's the pivot of symmetry, the feather that isn't there, and yet defines everything else. One scroll even describes 0 using bird behavior. A peacock sees another and fans its tail. 2 tails, 2 birds. One peacock sees no other, yet still fans. 1 tail, 1 dance, no partner. Thus the 0 is danced, not seen. It's poetic, but also weirdly sound logic for describing independent identity and relational values. You're invited to a special midday lesson where students explore multiplication and division using peacock-shaped counters. Feathers indicate digits, crests for units. But in the middle of the board sits a single counter with no markings, just a blank wooden disc. It's called the shunya piece, emptiness. Try dividing anything by it, and the students will just grin and shout, "Impossible!" One girl even smacks your hand with a stylus when you try to sneak a number over it. The teacher explains, to divide by 0 is to expect feathers from the wind. No matter how long you chase it, nothing lands in your hand. It's the most poetic math burn you've ever received. In the late afternoon, You visit the sculpture hall where artisans are carving reliefs for a temple facade. One slab shows a dancing Shiva, surrounded by circles and arcs. Hidden in the background, a row of peacocks, each with a missing feather, each tail fanned around a hollow center. The void within the pattern, the sculptor murmurs. Shunya is not absence, it's potential. And suddenly it hits you. Zero is not about nothingness. It's about starting. It's the beginning of measurement, the silent point before the rhythm, the invisible beat before the peacock screeches. Some scholars say the Gupta use of zero emerged from astronomy, trying to mark eclipses and planetary cycles. Others suggest it came from linguistics, the way silence was written as a symbol between syllables. But watching these students, artisans, and mathematicians, you're convinced it may just have started here. Watching birds who danced for no reason, who marked space with beauty, who pecked at dust as if it held truth. Back in the courtyard, the peacocks have returned. They're quieter than usual, lazily stepping between the fig trees, half-heartedly lifting their tails in the warm breeze. Arya joins you again, handing over a slate. On it, he's written a single number, 0, nothing else. Just that. You know what it is now? He asks. You nod. Everything that isn't, he grins, and everything that might be. You sit together in silence for a while, watching the sun dip low, casting golden light through the filigree of branches. A peacock lets out a soft, almost embarrassed honk, and you think, maybe that's what zero sounds like. A thick drizzle darkens the skies by morning. The tiles are slick, and even the peacocks, usually so flamboyant, seem resigned to the mood, strutting in slow motion with soggy feathers trailing behind them like bedraggled tapestries. But the downpour doesn't halt the monks, not even close. Today is market day. You follow the students down a winding mud path toward the village ledger's house, a squat, tile-roofed building perched on the edge of the mango grove. Inside, scribes sit cross-legged, hunched over scrolls, tally boards, and bowls full of smooth pebbles. One of them waves you over. "Welcome to the books," he says, not looking up. "Counting chickens?" "No." "Counting peacocks?" "Always." And so begins your tour of ancient Gupta bookkeeping, bird-based accounting edition. Turns out, some of the more rural tax collectors and storehouse managers developed a mnemonic system that used the peacock's body as a math reference. Why? Well, because everyone knew what a peacock looked like, and more importantly, they remembered them. You can forget a merchant's ledger. You won't forget a peacock flashing its tail in the middle of your millet shipment. The first ledger you're shown is charmingly crude. Feather ink strokes on bark paper, each line ending with a tiny peacock symbol. "That's shorthand," a boy explains. "One tail up means 5. If the tail is curved, that's a half unit." You lean closer and start noticing a whole code of peacock body math. Head up, unit value of 1 beak open, shan multiplier. X2 tail, fanned, 10 claws visible, denote. Subtraction wings extended, jakyrs odd number grouping. Sitting posture, wadyrshers null. Transaction, a full tax log might contain only a dozen peacocks drawn in. Different poses, but a skilled scribe could read it like a balance sheet. You glance at one particularly animated page and whisper, "That's a -4 in mango debts, isn't it?" The scribe grins. And he still hasn't paid it. It's math. It's pictogram. It's bird-based ledger magic. Historians still argue whether this system was widespread or localized to more creative tax outposts. But similar markings appear in storage temples, royal garden records, and even field-watching reports from the Vindhya region. Whether symbolic or practical, the peacock body became shorthand for logic, quantity, and visual elegance. One shopkeeper near the east gate pulls you into her stall and shows off her scale, a shallow tray decorated with 12 small peacock heads around the edge. "Each head marks a unit," she says. "This groove is the half point. I count in beak steps." She places a stone in each section like clock hands ticking. It's mesmerizing. If someone's coins don't add up, she just spins the tray and points to the missing head. "Balance is tail smooth," she says. "If not, it's off." And balance, you're beginning to realize, is everything. You return to the monastery's west wing, where the students have constructed a massive wooden grid on the floor. Each square represents a field section, and each field has a designated peacock form: dancing, high yield, sleeping, fallow calling, medium return, mating, expect growth. They giggle at this one. The students step from square to square, narrating imaginary tax predictions. 3 dancing peacocks and 1 caller in quadrant 4C, says a tall boy. 20 bundles of barley. It's a farming simulation. With birds, you're amazed the monks didn't invent SimCity 5 centuries early. But it goes further than farming. You watch as 2 scribes calculate temple donations using an abacus whose beads are carved into miniature peacock torsos. It's both adorable and vaguely unsettling. Dozens of tiny eyes judging every calculation. One boy explains that the peacock isn't just symbolic of quantity, but of legitimacy. A number marked with a full fan is considered verified, he says. You never cheat a number that dances. Then comes your favorite example. A young girl unrolls a thin parchment bearing what she proudly calls the Peacock Table of Transactions. Each row lists a merchant, a borrowed item, a repayment time, and a peacock symbol. But instead of writing how much they owe, she draws 1 peacock with 1 eye closed, loan repaid, no interest, 2 peacocks facing opposite, yard bartered goods, a molting peacock, delayed repayment, a peacock flying away, merchant vanished. You can't stop laughing. Is that legal shorthand? You ask. It's interpretive, she shrugs, but accurate. The teacher strolls by, overhearing this, and adds, sometimes the visual says more than numbers ever could. Our ancestors trusted form and figure. At first, it all seems like a delightful oddity. But then you look closer. The peacock isn't just decoration. It's a visual anchor. In a world where paper is scarce, literacy isn't universal, and ink fades faster than debt forgiveness, you need a system people remember. And what's more memorable than a bird that literally glows? Even in temple donation inscriptions, peacock-coded numerals help denote large values. You're shown a copper plate where each section contains a symbol of peacock with 3 feathers bent, equivalent to 100 silver coins. A footnote explains its worth in coinage, but also in beauty, dignity, and tail symmetry. No big deal. Historians sometimes dismiss this as regional flourish, but recent excavations suggest that peacock-coded accounting appeared from Ujjain to Nalanda, from royal courts to fishing villages. It wasn't standardized, but it was trusted. And that's the point. You watch one final ritual unfold in the corner of the record hall. A tax scribe, having completed a difficult scroll, dips a feather into red ink and stamps it once at the top of the page. It's not a signature, it's a confirmation. 1 fanned mark for balance, 1 feather down for finality. You ask if anyone ever falsified peacock records. The teacher sighs. Once a merchant forged a second tail on his tax sheet. We caught him. He now sweeps the peacock pens. And just like that, the rain outside stops. The sky clears. The peacocks strut back into the courtyard like they've forgiven the weather for daring to dampen their style. A few feathers scatter in the wind, catching the light just so. You pick one up. Long, soft, luminous. Value, priceless. It's mid-morning and the sun slants through the cloisters in sharp golden shafts. You've spent so many days surrounded by fluttering scrolls and the occasional feather that it almost feels normal. But then a temple bell rings 3 times. Slow, deliberate, ceremonial. You follow the sound into the artisan's quarter of the monastery, where the scent of stone dust, beeswax, and jasmine oil thickens the air. Masons, sculptors, and bronze casters are hard at work shaping sacred forms for an upcoming shrine. You expect solemnity, maybe a hushed reverence. Instead, you hear this. No, no, no. That peacock wing is 1/8 too long. Do you want Lakshmi to trip over it? Art meets math. At the center of the space is a massive slab of polished black basalt. halfway carved into the image of a goddess rising from a lotus, flanked by two intricately detailed peacocks. A sculptor runs her hand across the tail of one bird, counting softly under her breath. 24 feathers. Spacing must match the right side exactly. And just like that, you've wandered into the realm of sacred geometry meets sacred birds. In the Gupta Empire, temples weren't just built. They were calculated. Every sculpture, corridor, and niche followed precise ratios laid out in ancient manuals known as Shilpa Shastras, texts that governed proportions not only for human figures, but for divine animals too. And no animal shows up more than the peacock. Each feather follows a golden arc, a boy tells you, tracing chalk lines on a copper tablet. We use tail fans to space altars, position pillars, even design entire floor plans. He's not joking. You're shown a blueprint of a shrine where the layout mirrors the full spread of a dancing peacock. Central sanctum as the body, 5 corridors as the feathers, side chapels as the flared eye spots. Historians still argue whether this was practical or symbolic architecture, but here the answer is both. You sit with an elderly sculptor who's carving a relief of Krishna playing the flute, a peacock resting beside him. She uses a caliper, a piece of string, and a wax feather template. Each eye on the tail, she mutters, must be spaced 1/5 the feather's length. No more, no less. You do some quick math. That's a perfect exercise in fractions, radial symmetry, and segment division, practical geometry hiding inside devotional art. Another student unrolls a linen cloth marked with nested triangles, all centered on a stylized bird's tail. This is the Mayur mandala, he says, a training diagram. You draw it first, then apply the ratios to sculptures. The mandala is stunning. Concentric arcs, radiating from a single point, feather-like curves dividing the page into angular slivers. It looks suspiciously like a pie chart trying to win a beauty contest. He adds, each feather tip marks a direction, 8 total, matching the cardinal points. Tail sweep equals shrine orientation. So yes, they're literally using peacocks to aim temples at the correct cosmic coordinates. Later, inside the bronze workshop, you're shown another marvel. A team of smiths is casting a ceremonial oil lamp shaped like a peacock. This one must balance, says the master craftsman, or it won't burn evenly. They weigh the wings, adjust the base, even measure the center of gravity based on the bird's stance. One miscalculation and the flame tilts. But if done right, the lamp casts a shadow shaped like a full fantail. Even fire respects the geometry. You wander into a quiet corner where a monk is painting on parchment, laying down a miniature manuscript page for a sacred math treatise. His brush glides effortlessly, recreating a peacock tail with 14 eye spots, each one labeled in Brahmi numerals. This is the measurement key, he explains. We match sculpture dimensions to these points. Like a template? He smiles. Like a ruler with style. There's something deeply touching about it. This marriage of form and function, of worship and math. The peacock isn't just decoration, it's the calibration device. The secret code that makes symmetry possible. A divine blueprint masquerading as a flashy bird. You return to the stone workshop just as a young sculptor makes a mistake. His feather arc is too sharp, disrupting the tail's flow. His teacher tuts once, hands him a feather fan and says, "Study this. It will teach you what the chisel can't." He holds it up, rotates it slowly, and you watch his eyes track the natural curves. It's part meditation, part engineering tutorial. 10 minutes later, he fixes the mistake. 1 feather. No compass needed. You're ushered into the shrine chamber, dimly lit and cool. On the floor lies a huge diagram chalked into the stone. A Vastu grid, the traditional layout matrix for temple design. Each square represents a god, a direction, or a natural element. And right in the western sector, a stylized peacock, marked with the number 16. 16, whispers a monk, is the peacock number. It echoes in dance steps, mantra syllables, feather clusters. It is balance. You count 16 columns in the shrine, 16 notches on the entry beam, 16 bells suspended from the rafters. design by dance, structure by shimmer. Historians sometimes claim this is superstition. But when you look at the way the temple glows in the late sunlight, the perfect alignment of shadows, the echo of your steps repeating back with geometric rhythm, it feels like truth. As you step back into the open air, another bell rings. A peacock struts past the courtyard edge, tail dragging like velvet, and pauses beneath an archway you now realize is shaped like a feather curve. You never saw it before. But now, you see it everywhere. The wind is thick with jasmine and something more elusive. Maybe sandalwood, maybe saffron, maybe the feeling that math is about to get suspiciously romantic. You follow a trail of flower petals through the eastern gardens of the monastery. They lead to a marble pavilion, where a group of poets sits cross-legged on woven rugs, trading verses like gossip. Bronze cups clink. Someone is sketching something poetic and mathematically absurd on the underside of a mango leaf. And at the center of it all, a peacock in full display. No surprises there. What does surprise you is that these poets are arguing about ratios. He fluttered his tail 6 times in the span of 4 flute beats. One insists, eyes ablaze. That's a rhythm ratio of 3-2. Divine tension. You're ignoring the pause intervals. The other replies, waving a frond. He strutted exactly 8 steps before circling. 8.5 is Fibonacci. Welcome to the Gupta romance of numbers, where math and bird flirtation are one and the same. You sit quietly and listen as they unfurl stories, comparing the patterns of peacock dances to verses, rhythms, and musical modes. And yes, they are dead serious. For them, the bird's courtship isn't just beautiful. It's structured, almost algorithmic. One poet unfurls a silk scroll. It's a hand-illustrated chart mapping peacock movement to metrical patterns used in Sanskrit poetry. The strut, Matra. The tail flick, Shadir Sezura. The call, Chwak emphatic meter. He's literally converted bird behavior into scansion. Historians still argue whether this was artistic whimsy or an early form of symbolic pattern analysis. But the poets? They don't care. They're too busy chasing the divine in tail feathers and syllables. A musician sets up a stringed veena and begins plucking a gentle raga, notes rising and falling in sync with a peacock pacing the courtyard wall. One boy begins composing aloud. 6 cries, 4 turns, 1 flare of jeweled sky, her heart divided. Divided? You ask? He points to the numbers. 6 and 4 divided becomes 10. 10 is fullness, completion. It's not a heartbreak poem, it's a math poem. Somewhere, Pythagoras quietly gasps. You're ushered to a quieter corner of the garden, where an older woman, clearly revered by the others, tends a spiral of arranged peacock feathers in the sand. Poets try to write love, she murmurs, but mathematicians? They measure it. You raise an eyebrow. Look at the spirals, she says. Each feather tip points to the next by a fixed angle, always the same arc. That arc is found in love poetry, temple curves, even the spread of jasmine vines. She draws it slowly in the sand, a widening spiral, feather by feather. It's called Sundari Chakra, the wheel of beauty. You recognize it immediately. It's the Fibonacci spiral, maybe not in name but in nature. The way each segment grows in proportion to the last, building complexity from simplicity. They've been counting it for centuries. It turns out, many Gupta poets believed love itself had a numerical rhythm, a balance of advance and retreat, silence and cry, movement and pause. And the peacock, vain, dramatic, rhythmically precise, was the perfect metaphor. One particularly dramatic scroll depicts a mathematical duel of love. A suitor writes a poem in perfect 8-syllable meter, and the lady replies in 13. Their exchange continues, 8, 13, 21, 34, until the 55-syllable stanza breaks her silence. Yes, they wooed each other with Fibonacci numbers. You sneak a glance at one of the newer students practicing on a slate. He's written 1. 1 call. 2. She turns. 3. Another cries. 5. They preen. 8. The moon watches. He shrugs. I'm not great with words, but the numbers always feel right. Later in a dim indoor gallery you spot a faded wall painting. It shows a peacock mid-dance, surrounded by a spiral of golden dots. Each dot bears a tiny number. 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8. A monk catches you staring. It's a love charm, he says softly. You trace the spiral, count the numbers aloud, and wish for someone who mirrors your rhythm. You laugh. That's not how Fibonacci works. Maybe, he grins. But the heart isn't ruled by logic, just patterns we pretend we don't recognize. Outside, the poets begin a performance, chanting verses in metered rhythm while a young boy in peacock-feathered garb performs a stylized dance. Every movement mirrors the poem's beat. Every footfall aligns with syllables. And just when you think it couldn't get more ridiculous, they pass around love tokens, tiny shells, each painted with numbers from a peacock-themed sequence. This one's 13, a girl says, blushing. It means you're halfway to destiny. You're pretty sure that's not mathematically accurate, but she's already gone, giggling into the jasmine. The sun begins to set, turning everything gold, and the musicians wind down. The peacocks return, more relaxed now, less performative. One perches on a stone ledge, tail drooping like a velvet curtain. You sit beside a young poet who's sketching curves on parchment. He doesn't look up. They taught us that numbers come from counting grain, he says. But I think they come from longing. You ask what he means? He shrugs. Why else would someone ever care what comes next? You sit in silence, watching feathers catch the last light. And suddenly, math doesn't feel cold anymore. Dawn creeps in slowly, blanketing the monastery in a cool lavender hush. The air hums with quiet anticipation, like something ancient is stirring in the roots of the earth. Today's lesson isn't about feathers or fractions or flirtatious Fibonacci spirals. Today is about puzzles. Specifically, the legendary peacock problem of Nalanda. You make your way toward the inner cloister, where the scent of fresh oil lamps and inked bark scrolls lingers. A row of students, faces taut with concentration, sits cross-legged before a large slate slab etched with spirals, numbers, and, you guessed it, a very smug-looking stylized peacock. At the front, a white-robed monk with silver in his beard raises a finger. Today, he says solemnly, you will attempt the 108 riddle. All chatter vanishes. A pin drop would echo. You've heard whispers about this. A math challenge so famous it's become ritual, performed each year at dawn during the Festival of Measures. You take a seat among the students, trying not to look like the one who still doesn't know the Sanskrit word for zero. The monk begins. In the gardens of Nalanda, there were once 108 peacocks. 1/3 danced. 1/4 cried. 1/5 preened. 1/6 slept. The rest stood silent by the banyan tree. How many stood silent? You blink. A math riddle disguised as a fable. A beautiful one, you glance around. Students begin scribbling furiously, translating poetic phrasing into crisp fractions. 1/3 of 108, 136. Then 1/4, 127. 1/5, 21/6. Wait, that can't be right. Peacocks don't split evenly. Unless we're talking cooked. And that's a whole other history topic. You redo the math more carefully. Chantanuate. 3 Jari 36. 108. Y chuam quadru nashuai 26 108. 6 Y yastandu 98 sakinshen 21 hikings. A boy beside you whispers, it's not about the math. It's about the remainder. The riddle was never meant to resolve. You raise an eyebrow. But the teacher hears. No, it resolves. If you know where to look. He walks slowly across the courtyard, picking up a fallen peacock feather. You seek the count of those who stood still. Not danced, not called, not preened. Stillness is harder to measure. Stillness. Absence. A callback to our old friend zero. And suddenly, you see the riddle differently. Each fraction is a shadow, but the real answer lies in what's left behind. You do the math again. 36 danced, 27 cried, 21.6 preened, 18 slept. Wait. That's the catch. Peacocks can't preen in fractions. Historians still argue whether this riddle was meant to teach arithmetic, patience, or humility. Some say it was a metaphor for the imperfection of earthly measurement. Others claim it's a hidden code for a lunar algorithm. Or maybe it's just a bedtime prank passed down for centuries. One student stands, scroll in hand. "I suggest that the total must be divisible by 60, she declares. Then all the fractions resolve neatly. She's not wrong. If you try 120 peacocks, the fractions become whole. But that breaks the poem. And in Gupta logic, breaking the poem to save the math is bad form. The monk smiles. "You've all solved it, and none of you have." Classic Gupta answer. He turns to you. "How many stood silent?" You say, "However many remain after the world stops watching." He grins. Then you're ready for your final lesson. You're led to a quiet alcove beneath the Bodhi tree, where a monk places a blank scroll in front of you. No instructions, no feathers, just a stylus and the wind. You wait, and then you begin sketching. Not numbers, not birds, just arcs, spirals, a fan of lines slowly widening from a single center. It becomes a tail, then a grid, then a wave, and suddenly you realize it's all the same thing. The curve of the feather, the ratio in the dance, the stillness in the call, the space where zero lives, the twist of love in numbers, the story wrapped in symmetry. All of it is the peacock. You sit there until the oil lamps are lit and the courtyard glows gold again. A final bell rings. The festival ends. The students rise and bow toward the eastern gate, where a carved mosaic of 108 peacocks fans across the wall, each one slightly different. Some are dancing, some calling, some still. One at the center is carved with no tail at all, 0. And yet, it draws your eye first. The monk beside you speaks softly, barely audible over the wind. "We do not count peacocks to measure them. We count them so we remember how beauty repeats." You nod. You understand now. Not just why they counted peacocks, but why they loved it. The sky turns a soft gray blue, like a faded silk curtain slowly drawing closed. The last rays of the sun slip behind the temple domes, and shadows stretch long and gentle across the polished stones of the courtyard. Somewhere in the distance, a single peacock gives one final call. Not loud this time, just a low, throaty echo. It sounds more like a sigh than a song. The monastery stills. You sit quietly beneath the banyan tree, back resting against its warm bark. The earth feels solid beneath you. Everything hums in perfect balance. Crickets, rustling leaves, distant chants. There are no scribes now, no poets, no monks murmuring proofs into the night air. Just you. And in your mind, numbers drift slowly like feathers on a breeze. Decimals, spirals, arcs. The rhythm of tail fans, the hush between cries, the pause before a peacock dares to dance. It all returns in soft lulling waves, patterns folding gently into dreams. Maybe this is what the mathematicians were chasing all along. Not solutions, not riddles, not even the divine. Just stillness, just beauty arranged in such a way that the world briefly makes sense. A final feather flutters down nearby. You don't pick it up. You don't need to. You close your eyes and let the last thoughts scatter. Symmetry, shimmer, silence, and as sleep edges in, you hear the monk's voice again. Not aloud, but faint and steady in your thoughts. We count the peacocks not to capture their grace, but to remind ourselves that we too belong to a pattern. A pattern you now feel fully wrapped within. Soft night, starlit sky, breath slowing. Drift, drift, drift. End of script. Sweet dreams.